The healthcare resources are escalating. It is unsustainable the way we are. I want to see the effective utilization of resources to address cancer in the most effective way. The use of data analytics and artificial intelligence is the first step in trying to understand the process that we have been following for years and to make improvement in that process. The data is a gold mine, and we have that, but we haven't effectively used it. The Cross Cancer Institute is a unique structure. It's a cancer-dedicated facility. It's not part of any other hospital. So all the data has been collected for years. In Department of Radiation Oncology, we will treat about anywhere from 4,000 to 5,000 patients. They all come at the front desk. They get the data recorded there of demographics. Then they go to different departments. They may go to Radiation Oncology department. They register there with their diagnosis, and then they go to different parts of the department. So everywhere the data is collected. So now, suppose there is an increase of 500 patients in this year. How will that impact? How many radiation oncologists should there be? How many nurses should there be? How many machines we need to buy? They're all correlated. And we have the data for the past 5 to 10 years. We know how the resources have been allocated in the past. Now, with very powerful technique, we know how all these factors, all these players, numbers and treatments and type of machines, and they are all correlated. With all this trend, we need to identify which are the problem areas, which are the more inefficient areas. Are we assigning resources to the problems that are actually major problems? Or are we spending our resources to disease entities or problems that are really not important? It affects only far and few between. So then we will know exactly where the resources need to be focused to get the maximum mileage of the limited resources that we need to have. Our plan is such that first we will work at the Cross Cancer Institute because it's a small, contained, standalone unit. All the data that is collected here stays here. And then we will go across to Calgary and look at the data of Tom Baker Cancer Center and see how we compare. And then once we have the whole picture of Alberta, then there's no reason why it couldn't be replicated elsewhere, because the problem of limited resources are also universal.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event this evening. I'm so happy to be here and finally have a chance to welcome all of you to this conversation this evening. My name is Peggy Garrity, and I have the privilege of serving as the Chancellor for the University of Alberta. This land has been a gathering place for centuries. I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory and the homelands of the Métis. In stating this, we must recognize our responsibility to work in relationship alongside First Nation and Métis people and their communities on our way forward, and in good relations in uplifting the whole people for the next 7 generations and the University of tomorrow. On behalf of my colleagues on the University of Alberta Senate, some of them are here tonight, I'd like to welcome you to the Chancellor's Forum. The forum was established in 2018 to invite the public to campus to engage with timely topics that were related to the University of Alberta. This topic for tonight was originally scheduled to take place on April 1st, 2020. Not April Fool's, really, but it did turn out to be a bit of a joke, I guess. After 2 long years of weathering the pandemic, I'm thrilled that we have the opportunity to connect again on campus. Whether you're joining us in person here this evening or through the live stream, or you get a chance to watch the recording later, thank you for joining us. Thank you as well to those who've sent questions in advance with your registration, and we've shared those questions with our moderator, Ryan Jesperson. Our focus this evening is, what does artificial intelligence mean for me, for my job, my health, my family, my home, and my community? Tonight is an opportunity to learn more and to share perspectives about how AI impacts our lives, our communities, and those we care about. We're joined by 4 remarkable individuals from the university who will help us demystify, or maybe I should say decode, this topic for us. In my brief time as Chancellor, I continue to be surprised by the remarkable things I've learned about the University of Alberta and its impact on our community. From the time the U of A launched Canada's first computing science department in 1964, that was one of those trivia questions, by the way, the U of A now is one of the top artificial intelligence and machine learning research universities in the world. This is not an overnight success story. It's an example of basic research leading to amazing and transformational discoveries. It's also an excellent example of multidisciplinary collaboration among a number of faculties and professors, and of partnership with industry and government. The university's early successes in AI include the development of a chess program by Dr. Jonathan Schaefer that tied for first place in the World Computer Chess Championship in 1986. This was followed by the creation of Chinook, the first checkers program to win a human world championship in checkers, and I didn't even know they had those, and which remains undefeated since 1994. In the early 2000s, the Computer Poker Research Group was developing superhuman poker playing programs. You see a bit of a trend there. But this is not just about fun and games. A turning point came in 2002 with the creation of the Alberta Ingenuity Centre for Machine Learning, a joint effort between the Government of Alberta and the U of A. Forward-looking investments by Alberta Innovates and the Government of Alberta enabled the Centre for Machine Learning, now known as the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute, or AMI, which is much simpler, to build a world-class team of researchers at the U of A and affiliated institutions. These leading minds are considering advances in scientific knowledge, as well as the social, political, and economic possibilities of AI. As Cam Linke reminded me a few weeks ago when we met, many of us think of AI as something that will impact us in the future, something closer to science fiction than science reality. But in fact, that future is happening right now. That's why I'm excited for tonight's discussion as we consider questions such as how the world will continue to change because of AI and how we might adapt as well. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our partners and the organizers of tonight's event: AMI, the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute, the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Science, the AI for Society, which is one of the signature areas at the U of A, and our whole external relations team. And of course, my staff and members of Senate too. In addition, thank you to the Faculty of Arts Resource Center, our American Sign Language interpreters, thank you very much, the campus ambassadors, and our volunteers in Senate and across campus who helped us to plan this event. I'm also deeply grateful to our panelists, and I would like to invite them to come out now and take their chairs here at the front. Thanks very much, and now I'm going to hand the mic over to you, Ryan, in just a minute. Welcome, Ryan Jesperson. As many of you know, I'm sure, Ryan hosts Real Talk, one of Canada's most downloaded modern talk shows. He recently graced the cover of Edify magazine as the Prince of Podcasting, and I'll never forget that cover photo of you. Ryan was named one of Alberta's 50 most influential people by Venture magazine, and was on Avenue's inaugural list of Edmonton's top 40 under 40. You'll find him online at ryanjesperson.com and on Twitter and Instagram at Ryan Jesperson. Ryan moderated, actually for us, the 2019 Chancellor's Forum on the opioid crisis, and we're really happy to have you back again. Thank you. Thanks, Ryan. We'll hand it over to all of you.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, Chancellor. I appreciate it, and it's an honor to be back. I'm so grateful that we're able to gather in person, and I want to recognize as well the literally hundreds of people that will be joining us live streaming as well. I'm grateful to have them as part of this conversation. I know that this is an engaged audience because of the questions that have already been submitted, and we're very much looking forward to covering a lot of ground. I'm going to try to, if you know me, you know how difficult this will be. I'm going to try to limit my whimsical observations and my meandering thoughts on the applications of AI because, as mentioned, we do have four brilliant professionals and visionaries, quite frankly, here with us on the stage tonight. But it's not lost on me that this is relevant. We see the opener from the Cross Cancer Institute, and we understand that AI in healthcare is an obvious talking point tonight. And we have an expert, one of the world's best, with us tonight to talk about that. But then I'm looking at the Q&A and the trivia, and I see that an AI named Benjamin wrote, directed, scored, and edited a short film. And it's not lost on me that in particular in the United States, they've been testing out AI talk show hosts and AI radio personalities. And so I have a keen interest in AI in the creative arts and AI in the performing arts. And I know from the questions that have been submitted to us that many of you come at this from many different angles. So let's get to it. I'm very much excited to introduce to you the panelists. We've gathered a couple of times already on Zoom, and I've had to tell them, save it for the Chancellor's Forum, because they interact great together, as you're about to see. Dr. Nicole Denier, sitting next to me, is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Alberta. Dr. Denier's research focuses on the labor market as an engine and a site of social transformation, with specific interest in economic disruption, labor mobility, and migration. Hero Laird, who had a graduate photo shoot today, by the way. Congratulations to you, Hero. Exciting time for you in the course of your career, and I've just loved your perspective already. I know you're bringing a lot to the table tonight. A student at the University of Alberta's Faculty of Law. Hero's work focuses on legal systems reform, access to justice, and the rule of law in a digital age. Hero's a research assistant with the Wacodwin Law and Governance Lodge and the president of the Digital Law and Innovation Society. Thanks for being here tonight. Dr. Ross Mitchell is a professor in the Department of Medicine, a fellow with the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute, AMI, and the senior program director of AI adoption with Alberta Health Services. Dr. Mitchell is also the inaugural AHS chair in AI in health at the University of Alberta. He's been working in the fields of biomedical imaging, AI, and machine learning applied to healthcare for 30 years. He moved from Florida to Edmonton, says Edmonton blows Florida out of the water. And rounding out our panel is Dr. Eleni Strulia, acting vice dean in the Faculty of Science and the director of the AI for Society signature area, a professor in the Department of Computing Science. Dr. Strulia's research focuses on addressing industry-driven problems, adopting AI and machine learning methods to improve or automate tasks. So let's get to it. I want to keep the opening question pretty simple, because our goal tonight is to determine what is artificial intelligence. What does AI mean to me, to us, collectively? What does it mean to you?
I started in this field in the context of cognitive science. Oops. So I got my degree in Greece, and when I started as a graduate student in Georgia Tech, it was a time when AI, the science and engineering of building intelligent machines, was motivated by the desire to make this biologically inspired. So in my thesis, I was exploring how a reflective learning, so how we learn from our experiences and primarily from our failures. And the high level is you know how to do things. At some point in time, somebody tells you this is wrong. And what you're trying to figure out is what in the process of what you did is exceptional from the right way of doing things. And by learning these exceptions, you build a better model for how to act. And in my case, the action was planning. And the thing that made it all cool is when I realized afterwards, when I was doing related research, that this is very similar to how kids learn language. So the story goes that in the beginning, young kids know that you say, I go, and then you learn that you say, I went in the past. But once they figure out the rule of ED being the past tense, they start making mistakes, and they say, I goed, when they knew that the right way of saying this is I went. And then they figure out that go is an exception. So the way I was building my reflective learning based on failures was akin to some phenomenon that had been observed in kids. And for me, that was the thing, oh my God, isn't this cool? We can do something that is related to how humans learn, and that can actually be useful in some settings. So that's how I was inspired back then when, and the rest is history.
Love it. Dr. Mitchell, what does AI mean for you?
For me, it's a tool to revolutionize healthcare, probably on par with development of washing hands and the stethoscope.
Wow.
I'll just leave it at that.
I like it. Saving time for later.
Yeah.
Veteran move. Ms. Laird, what does it mean to you?
You know, I think I'll start also with a story that I was working in the nonprofit sector and we were doing all this work around how we could make the world a better place, and I got a phone call. And someone said, I read your stuff, but you don't have anything about data. Don't forget about the data, or you're gonna get left behind. And I think of William Gibson's quote that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And so for me, AI is a signal. It's this exciting, amazing world of things we can do with technology. And it's important to me that we think about how we really do use that to change the world in ways that hopefully work for all of us.
We've had a common theme in the questions that have been submitted ahead of time from audience members, and there's a lot of interest in talking about equity and access and ethics, and we'll certainly spend time on that this evening. Dr. Denier, what does AI mean for you?
So I actually got into AI through teaching. I teach this undergraduate course in the sociology of work and industry that is mainly for engineering students, right? It's the social impact requirement for them. And we talk about how previous industrial revolutions and their technologies shape current work practices. And students were increasingly interested in AI, so I thought, okay, I need to incorporate this into my teaching, and I did. And one of the ways I get them to think about it is actually to ask them to how they would incorporate AI into my job, right? These are engineering students, they're going to work with AI systems, they're going to create AI systems. You know, what is the threat to my own job, right? And I frequently get the answer from my students that they could incorporate grading, AI tools to take over my grading work, that we'd learn from previous good answers and run their answers against them. So I offered to do this, like, let's develop this tool, let me grade your finals with this, and the answer is always a resounding absolutely not, like, do not do this. And so to me, this was this great puzzle, right? We have people who are familiar with the technology who will use it, but in this situation don't want to be judged by it. So I think this is a good illustration of the point, and many of the points I hope we'll discuss tonight, which is this is going to be distributed unevenly across workplaces. The stakes are going to be different for different people, right? Grading has an impact on people's futures. That is high stakes for the students, not as much for me to remove a somewhat tedious aspect of my job, right? So that's what I'm super interested in, how it gets distributed.
I do want to encourage all four of you to feel free to engage with one another. Let's treat this like a working organism, this living conversation that we're having tonight. Don't wait for me to tap you on the shoulder if you'd like to jump in with something. I want to throw something out to the group because we talk about students that are fascinated by this assignment, yet they don't want to be judged by it, or they don't want to be graded by it. But we already know that AI is a factor in things like job application scenarios, right? People are shortlisted or not based on AI, et cetera. So, I mean, it sort of fits into that premise that the future is now. People are already being judged by AI, whether they know it or not.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, you bring up the example of employment, and this is something that's near and dear to my heart, right? I'm a sociologist of work. I study inequality in the labor market. And that is a key site where we're seeing transformations. And I think it's also a key site where we can see positive development. So you have spectacular examples of failures, right? Amazon had this resume ranker where they had learned from past applications who they should prioritize in their hiring decisions. And it famously really liked men, right? So they just developed this tool that ranked women's resumes lower than men's. And it was sort of reported widely in the media. They scrapped it. But we now have tools that we can analyze biases in these types of algorithms. People are aware of it. We can expand our training data. We can expand the applicant pool that our tools learn from. And so I think that's a positive development. I think maybe an even bigger question, though, is what applications are we developing in the first place, right? Are we developing applications that are intended to control workplaces? Are we developing applications that make work easier for people? I think Uber is a prime example. Uber, Lyft, platform-type companies that have gig workers present a lot of potential scary scenarios, right? Where you have an app that is tracking employee behavior, that is making decisions about what employees can and should do, maybe even automatically firing people with little recourse. And so the question is, are we orienting these platforms towards control, surveillance, exclusion, punishment, or are we using them to improve people's lives, right? You can maybe automatically enroll people in systems to make sure they have more skills rather than excluding them from employment.
Actually, one thing that's interesting about how we choose people comes to defining success. So I'm involved in a project with occupational therapy, and the question is, who is going to be a good occupational therapist? Obviously, grades matter, and grades are easily accessible because we're all evaluated through our high school, through our old transcripts. However, if you're going to be somebody who's dealing with people, there are other criteria that come to being an effective care provider. And this is not visible in the scores, in the numbers. So I think part of the problem in judging people for access to the next level or a job or education is to make sure that whatever criteria we're using are not there because we have the data to evaluate this criteria, but rather because they're predicting success. So some schools have interviews, and now we're playing around with the idea of having video interviews and shortening the process, but really keeping the essentials of empathy that can be seen by looking at somebody conversing.
Like you think of, go ahead, Hiro.
I was going to say, I think you both bring up really important points that we get to choose. And sometimes, you hear these sort of terror stories of like, oh no, AI is going to take my job, and the stories are real. Like looking at the justices, and we have people who are in jail based on an algorithm's perception of them and the data that fed into that, whether it was useful or not.
Can you explain that a little bit? Like how that actually would happen?
So it's sort of the stories that they both told, where you say, okay, well, what's the data we have available that decision makers are using? So in the criminal justice system in the United States, they have particular criteria that they use for whether someone's a high-risk offender. And then based on those criteria, you're looking at, okay, should this person get bail, or what kind of a sentence should this person get? And so you have people in jail now because an algorithm deemed them higher risk than someone else. And like we heard, the data that we have now has bias in it because the systems we have are biased. So if you're a black male in the United States, you have a much higher chance of being in jail. But if you encode that bias and you magnify it through an algorithm that learns that again and again instead of changing the system. So when we look at, when I look at legal reform or reform in health or other systems, you think, how do we think about who benefits, where the data comes from, who's using the data, which machines interface with which human beings as a part of that AI kind of, so it's a social system as well. And so the exciting part for me is that instead of looking at it as like, oh, it's definitely bad or it's definitely good, all of AI kind of fits into this narrative, to kind of get curious about that and say, how can we work together with all this amazing expertise to design systems that do work for everyone and don't work against the people that are already getting the short end of the stick.
Yeah, well, there's an amazing, I want to go, this is an audience submitted question, it's a good one. How can we ensure the use of AI doesn't exacerbate further societal inequity, particularly as its use and ownership tends to align with those who already have power? like big corporations or government? It's a great question.
You're looking
Hugely
at me.
important.
So if I can jump off and then I'll hand it to my colleagues. I think for me, it's make sure AI doesn't only shape you. Like, get in there and shape AI, whether that's through your legal systems and who you elect, or whether it's through getting involved in expertise. There's these, I had a great conversation actually through one of the AI for Society forums on the stories we tell about AI, because it's kind of this magic black box. Like you say, oh, I could never know about it. It's really hard. It's always the next newest thing. Only experts can know. And that means that we seed the field to a very small number of people based on the stories we tell about AI. And that has nothing to do with the technology. So if there's one thing I could leave the audience with, it's make sure you get in there and ask those questions about who's making decisions, whether it's a robot or a human, and how you can get involved in being a part of that.
And you're already doing it by being here tonight, so good job already. Dr. Mitchell, isn't it interesting, because we're, here we have examples, and very real examples of where the human element is significant, if not incredibly important or even critical. You might look at, off the top of my head, someone who trades stocks, and you might suggest that maybe the human element is a bit of an impediment, or would leave room for error on a judgment call of when to buy or when to sell. And then we look at industries like Hero's describing and our other panelists, and healthcare would be one of them, wouldn't we? We talk about a clinician's bedside manner. We talk about the qualities or the empathy we expect or need from a doctor. But at the same time, when a lot of people talk about the future of AI, healthcare is probably one of the very first things they think about. So this marriage is an interesting one of technology and humanity.
Yeah, so healthcare is a bit of a different beast. It's very highly regulated, more regulated than defense or banking. So in healthcare, we don't think so much about replacing people as augmenting what they do. So you don't want the legal liability to rest on an algorithm, because an algorithm can't get sued. So it's important that the human have the final say. So the tools that have been interested in building are there to help physicians and frontline healthcare workers do their jobs more efficiently and ideally more enjoyably, to try and get rid of the boring stuff that they have to do and get them back to being physicians and caretakers instead of data entry clerks. That's sort of the goal that we have. Ideally, in the future, we always tend to overestimate what will happen in 2 years and underestimate what will happen in 10. So I always say between 2 and 10 years from now, hopefully we will have, you'll go into your primary care physician's office and there'll be no visible computer and no keyboard, and they'll look at you instead of the screen, right? And you won't have to tell them 10 times when you were born as you go in for your encounter. So that's what we want to get towards, is ideally everything. There's a computer there listening and transcribing and maybe even suggesting things to the physician, but they're focused on you and not on the screen. Wouldn't that be revolutionary in healthcare?
Yet I do have cheat notes here from our previous conversations, and I happen to know that I don't want to characterize your, but it strikes me as that perhaps you're not as optimistic as you may sound at first time around with regards to the ability to transform an entire healthcare delivery system.
Yeah, it's really, really tough. So healthcare also has enormous inertia, and you can't turn a fully loaded super tanker very quickly. It's going full steam in one direction. And that's what we have with healthcare. Healthcare is based a lot on tradition, and even universities are based a lot on tradition. And when you mix the two to try and bring the AI from the academic side over to the clinical side, you run into traditions that are barriers that are there just because they're there. And so it's really, really tough. Most of AI healthcare now is academic publications, and almost none of it is translated into care. I don't know of a single AI system that's broadly deployed across North America. There's here and there in certain institutions, there are applications that are narrow and deep, but there's no broad scale AI deployed in healthcare.
Would you have an opinion as to why?
Well, it's the culture of healthcare. Healthcare doesn't like change, they don't like risk. And we are concerned about privacy. And we say, in the business that next to a patient's healthcare, their next most precious thing is their privacy, and rightfully so. And so there's so much concern about privacy now that they have, the pendulum, in my opinion, has swung too far in one direction, and the urgency about privacy actually prevents us from getting data to build AI algorithms. So if you are in the healthcare sector, it's extraordinarily difficult to get data. And so you can't build the algorithms. You say, I want to build an algorithm that will reduce morbidity and mortality and save you umpteen $1 million a year, and they go, sorry, you can't have the data. We won't let you build that algorithm because we won't let you have access to the data. But I'm part of the system, like I'll sign whatever contracts you want, you can monitor, I've never leaked anything before, but there's a risk of giving you access to the data. And traditional research, as an academic on the university side, you go to the healthcare system and say, I'm doing a study on lung cancer, and I want data about these patients, and I want, if you think of your data as rows and columns as a spreadsheet, the rows are patients and the columns are all the things we measure about their patients, their body temperature, when they had medications, how big their tumor is. And you would go to them and say, I want these rows and these columns, and you get that and you do your research. But in AI, we go to them and we say, I want it all. Give me it all, right? Because I don't know what columns are important and I don't know which patients, and I'll use the algorithms to figure that out. And that's fundamentally against the culture of research going back 50, 60 years in healthcare. So you have to overcome that. And even like for years, my grant applications were turned down because they said it's not science. You're throwing spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks. And in science, you have a hypothesis, you perform an experiment, collect data that confirms or refutes that hypothesis, and you repeat. And the worst thing you can do is go mucking about looking in data for patterns. If I had a professor who used to say, if you do not have a hypothesis, you are not doing science. So we would construct a simple hypothesis, which is if we muck about in the data, we will come up with something interesting. That's our hypothesis, right? And that doesn't fly, they don't get that. So we get these grant after grant after grant turned down, and I'd say to my students, well, at least we can take consolation in the fact that the guy who turned us down probably drove his Tesla home on autopilot.
But there is hope. So I have failed multiple times, like Rose says, to get access to data. However, what's different now is access to health-related data that is not clinical. Everybody's wearing a wearable. There are many devices. So FDA has approved a bunch of devices, and one I was reading recently is for cardiac monitors. So you go to your doctor, and instead of actually getting the doctor to ask you questions about how many times did you feel arrhythmia, and you have to remember what happened last 2 weeks, they will give you the device, you'll wear it, the data will be collected, and in 2 weeks you will go to your doctor's office and you will have concrete evidence that is calibrated, the device has been tested, it has some process to be approved through FDA, and this is valid data that helps in diagnosis. So I think what we see here as patients, as people who are, for better or worse, becoming owners of some data that is relevant but not clinical, we see a drive or a pull from the patients and the consumers to use this data for good. And I hope that this kind of insight and need, and the fact that it's actually possible, you can have contact lenses that can measure insulin. And why wouldn't you do that? And you would expect your kid to measure their insulin regularly through the typical devices. If anybody has teenagers, they know how trustworthy they are to do the right thing at the right time every day. So there are many things that are practical because of technology advances, and I think this will shift the climate on privacy and what data can be used, plus the argument that we saw in the original video about the value of data and the potential of saving costs in our public healthcare system, especially in Canada, where we do have a public healthcare system. I think this is what we need to do to educate and sort of get access to the data that Ross has been talking about, which indeed is very difficult to get access to.
And if I can build on that, I think it's part of the reason I'm so excited about interdisciplinary work around artificial intelligence, because you sort of wonder, like, well, what does the law have to contribute? There's sort of, and I sense sometimes that law is always 20 years behind, sort of, doing the gritty work in the back. But I think with artificial intelligence, we've heard trust come up a lot.
Yeah.
And thinking about privacy, we had a lot of questions from the audience about privacy and worries about that. Who is going to be using all this data that's out there? How can I trust them? And the sort of boring and not very sexy answer is the rule of law. And there's something to that. Like, how do we build trust across society? And ethics has a role to play. And there's a little tension here sometimes in the different fields, but I would sort of suggest perhaps that underneath ethics you have that foundation of law, that there are rules, that there are procedures to follow, and I think that's where we can be in conversation about how to build trust and access the data, and as Eleni put it so well, use that data for good.
And I think, just sorry to build on this and build on Ross's principle that I think was really helpful, right? Thinking about augmentation rather than simple automation. And if you take that as a starting point, developing AI systems is really less threatening, right? And might help build trust. So we're doing a lot of interdisciplinary research here at the U of A, which sort of tries to incorporate a lot of these perspectives from law, and in my case, sociology. I'm working on a large grant from the UK Canada Artificial Intelligence Initiative with colleagues in the Faculty of Science, Linglong Kong and Beijing, as well as my colleague Karen Hughes in the Faculty of Business. And we're taking the starting point is how can we develop tools for HR professionals that will provide them information to de-bias their decisions, right? So we're trying to look at how to change the language in job advertisements to attract more diverse candidate pools, right, for very specific contexts. And that's much more complicated than it may sound as I'm telling you this, but right, identifying the context where you need to de-bias is really hard. Do we have gender segregated occupations, racially segregated occupations? How is language different in Canada versus the United Kingdom? And so these conversations coming together from the inception of the project are so important about what gets deployed in the end.
And another thing that's happening now is explanation. So instead of making a recommendation that says the answer is 42, we are pushing for explanations. And there are two fundamental different kinds of explanation. One is a trace of how the algorithm came up with the answer based on, and that is basically requiring some kind of understanding of the algorithm design. But there's an alternative kind that actually does simulations of the answer is 42 because between the choices, the two choices that you have, this is the most likely answer that will have probably the most positive outcome if we were talking about health. So these are forward simulations of the alternative possible answers that document why one is preferable and more likely to be correct. So it's our job as technologists to develop explanations that would increase the trust and will treat the user with respect and give them the authority to finally say, yes, this is the right answer, I believe, I trust this, and it's my name that is actually making the decision.
This may be a bit of a stretch, but I want to introduce a current event to provide some context. I'm not sure how many folks are familiar with this Blue Dot story. There's nothing particularly unusual about what happened, but Blue Dot, a private enterprise, or at least a corporate enterprise, made data available, purchased by the Public Health Agency of Canada through the course of COVID to be able to understand humans' behavior, Canadians' behavior. Were people going to pharmacies to access PPE or what have you? Ultimately, maybe when the first roll of vaccines were available. Were more people staying at home? Were people gathering together against public health recommendations or public health legislation, for that matter, public health orders? These types of statistics were collected, so says Blue Dot, so says the Public Health Agency of Canada, anonymously. Perhaps there's no reason to believe that's not true. It was presented in the form of a news piece that introduced, unfortunately this week, a partisan angle on the discussion, which I thought was unfortunate, because I tried to facilitate just a more general conversation around, are you cool with being tracked or not? And some people quickly said, well, you're being tracked all the time, and you should read the terms of service of your phone, and you should understand how apps work, and basically, duh. And other people said, well, you know what, it hadn't really occurred to me that maybe all these movements might be tracked, and is it kind of strange that if I'm gathering privately with my friends, whether it's in defiance of a public health order or not, that AI or location services or the Find My Phone app would be potentially made available to have authorities show up and detain me in remarkable circumstance, right? And it was an interesting kind of a back and forth about, Hiro, when you say that, we need to get involved because there can be concerns and we need to insert ourselves in these conversations, and the rule of law should provide, maybe not solace, but some assurance that this is at least on legislators' radar. People, I think, assume there's a bit of something happening behind the curtain with regards to AI. The average person doesn't have a huge understanding of it or how it applies to their everyday life.
And I think also there's an acknowledgement that legislation happens slowly, which some might argue that that's the way it should go. So there's sober thought and consideration, and everybody knows how that goes, right?
I was going to say, have you considered joining the Faculty of Law? I think you've got it.
So the question
Got
is government capable of keeping up? Can government keep up? Can we trust the rule of law? Should people be concerned? Should people surrender their sense of privacy? Is that a generational thing, perhaps?
That's a lot of questions.
It is.
You know, and I think I would say that part of the reason I do encourage people to get involved is because government isn't only the people that sit in your parliament. It's the staff that support them, it's the people that come out, it's the think tanks that they get advice from, and there's a whole international system too of countries looking at each other and saying, okay, well, what's the EU doing around, you know, the General Data Protection Regulation, which sounds really geeky, and it is super long and geeky, but they're sort of looking at how do we start regulating data, and then others are sort of having that conversation, and so that's a live conversation globally right now. Some of you might have seen that China just made some waves with some new declarations around regulating AI at a pretty general level, and I think there's an opportunity for Canada to dig in and have those conversations and take some further steps in making sure that we are responding through legislation and regulation. And if we decide not to, that it's an intentional decision to say, okay, you know, we've decided no rules, you know, but my guess, and it was, I think, reflected in the audience comments, is that some rules might be helpful, and that we can start looking at other places and decide what do we want that conversation to look like in Canada. I know Michael Geist has done some work around that, and many others, and I think we have the chance to shape that here, so.
An interesting part, kind of a tangent about rules, is the issue of selling data. I think it's important to realize the data is valuable, and in fact there's some interesting work in Europe where they build co-ops for patients to donate their data, and then the co-op can decide to sell the data to pharmaceuticals potentially, but then the money comes back to the co-op and can support other studies. So I think what I would like to see is an effort to somehow take care of data for the public good and have public agencies or not-for-profits governed by some kind of legal frameworks that would take the ownership of the curating and managing and make use of the data appropriately. Because right now, all our data is in different companies. Fitbit knows exactly what I'm doing, and at some point in time, it would be nice if my doctor knew if it becomes relevant, but it's not really easy. And I would like it to be easier, and I would like it to be very much my decision.
But if we're talking about an even landscape or fair play or equity or ethics, oh gosh, how do I approach this next question? I'll just ask it directly. I mean, what shot in hell does you know, a person with some real legitimate health problems being logged by their Fitbit have of getting what we would deem to be fair, and that's a loaded question in this context, fair health insurance or coverage? Or what about pre-existing conditions? What about insurance companies? We could talk for an hour and a half about this, couldn't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the context. I'm a sociologist, so I'm going to be like, everything is the context, right? We're in a society where we have at the provincial level single-payer healthcare. So I think in the United States, that's a much bigger issue than it is here. And so when we think about the ethics of AI, when we think about what's going on, when we think about regulation, it changes what we're going to do. So I would not be in the Canadian context that concerned with maybe Alberta Health knowing something about my Fitbit data. If we were in the United States, I would absolutely be concerned that my insurer knew about my Fitbit data. Yep. And I think Ross might have more to say about that, but yeah.
Well, it's funny because, so I just moved here in December as the Senior Program Director for AI Adoption at Alberta Health Services. And one of the things they wanted me to do right away when I came was work with a team there to predict length of stay in some of the big hospitals. But I can't get access to the data. They won't give me access to the data. And every time I ask, they say, well, the Alberta's Health Information Act precludes you getting access to the data because you're not an employee of Alberta Health Services. I'm technically an employee of the university. I just have an appointment at a senior level in Alberta Health Services. And so I say, well, how am I going to help you build the model if I can't have the data? And so it's been a couple months now, and it just goes around and around. And it ends up, I believe that it's lawyers in the privacy office at Alberta Health Services interpreting the Health Information Act in a way that precludes me from getting access to data. And what I often hear is Alberta's Health Information Act was written 20 years ago, before AI was really a thing in healthcare. And lots of people have been trying to get it updated for 20 years. No luck. And they say, well, we'll keep working on that. And I say, I don't have another 20 years. Sorry, guys. I need data access tomorrow, not 10 years from now. If you want me to help streamline flow through hospitals in Alberta and reduce costs, I need access to the data to do it, and I don't have it.
I'll tell you, Ross, I feel your pain, and at the same time, I'm thrilled that people have such a hard time getting our health data. So,
yeah, but I have an appointment as the senior program director, and they hired me to do this.
I get it. This is, we talk about, in this question, I'll ask it as the audience member submitted it, but what are the dangers inherent in AI, and how can we minimize risk? And I would suggest that each of our panelists could probably approach this in their own unique way. Maybe instead of dangers, we could, you keep it there, or red flags, or?
Yeah, I think for me, the dangers are using it for automation rather than augmentation. I think that there are dangers when we don't have a clear goal in mind, right? When our goals are dubious, right? So we need to come up with agreed upon end goals, right? We have a massive quantity of data now, right? There are so many areas that are going to be touched by AI. There are so many industries that are going to be fundamentally transformed by AI. And so how do we empower people to know what's going on with that in their workplaces, in their home lives, to intervene if the system is going to produce suboptimal outcomes, right? And that involves lots of input at every stage of development. That's cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary input on the academic basic research side of things, but that's also input from end users, people who are going to be employers implementing new technologies, workers associations, professionals associations, unions. And so having all of that input at every stage is going to be incredibly important, and it's also going to be incredibly difficult to implement.
Yeah, and I think, from a legal perspective, there's all kinds of analogies to existing pools of data that might be helpful here. Like you think about when your criminal record can be used in different things. We have special rules for when you are not allowed to rely on a criminal record that's for a youth, that we sort of give people that second chance if they've been accused of something when they're 14 versus when they're 24. We sort of say, don't look at the one when they're 14. And again, I should say at this point, I'm not a lawyer, so. But so we can look at that and say, well, who should be able to have control? Is the access always and forever, or only for limited times, or only for limited issues? Like you mentioned insurance, maybe we have concerns around when insurance providers should have access to certain kinds of data, and that's already true. So it's sort of, there are ways to step forward through what we already have and say the rules we have apply to AI. Like it's not magic. It's something we can think about and define and put in the boxes that we already have and use the safeguards we already have on hand. And at the same time, sort of having come from looking at some of the things happening in Europe and other places, I think we have an opportunity to step more into that here and be proactive about what some more of those safeguards should look like, and make sure that people do have the chance to say, maybe some people are excited about having everyone access their health data and say, great, lay it on me, I want all the good health, here's my data. And other people might say, no, don't put me in the pool. And so how do we sort of think about that so we get good research and good health outcomes and use that data for good, but also respect that law and trust building and where we're going as a society that's a big ship, as you put it, to move. And it's okay sometimes to say, we're not going to do all of this at once. We can look at the parts where people are going to volunteer their data, or where the data is accessible in different ways already, and not maybe push at, as an example, I'm not sure I'm comfortable having people put in jail based on an algorithm. I think that's a very serious thing to put into a system we're not totally sure about yet. So.
You talk about like the volunteering, the information thing, and I'm sure that many of us have had just the candid, everyday conversation with friends about, you talk about, maybe you're going to replace your toaster oven, and you're talking to the person you live with, and then the next time you check your social media, the ad for the toaster oven pops up, right? And you it weirds you out, and half the people are kind of like, what's this all about? And the other half are like, oh, sweet, that's convenient, boom. And it works, right? And so there's kind of this, do you feel sometimes like you're swimming against the stream if you're fighting it, you know, and at some point, like I'd be curious to know, I guess I'm asking you all to surrender, to give us some insight into your personal lives here and how you structure the settings in your phones and your computers, but like, do you as experts in AI, Eleni, would we be surprised at the level of security or the non-disclosure, or how do you approach that stuff with your personal technology?
I do not know how I feel about saying that I loved Facebook. I stayed in touch with a favorite cousin of mine in Greece, and it was lovely because I could see her kids grow up. And then Cambridge Analytica happened, and I was out, I don't know, a couple of months after that. It was just too much. I knew that I was revealing probably too much, and they had information, but the lack of controls on how they share data was just overwhelmingly, I don't even think, I mean, it was anywhere between naive and stupid and offensive. So I'm not on Facebook, and I made sure that my GPS is not alive all the time. And I use the Tim Hortons app, and I never switch on the GPS because they did this thing where if you use the Tim Hortons app, they switch on, they require you by default to have the GPS on no matter whether you're going to Tim Hortons or not. And they knew that people were traveling across the country for no good reason at all. So I am much smarter about what I share, but I'm not completely obsessive. And I think in the end, we have to talk about risks and challenges. It's very difficult to answer on principle. It's much more important to think about what good can come out of it. Because really, my health data is my health data, but if contributing it could save Albertans something, I think it's my responsibility as a citizen, as long as we live in a place where we have public health care. So I think the conversations have to be a little bit more sophisticated about privacy. We have to give privacy up to some degree in order to receive the benefits of actually analyzing the data and figuring out what's the right thing to do with healthcare. And that's the kind of thing that I would like to see discussed. On the other hand, no Facebook, you know, better safe.
So personally, I'm pretty locked down with all my devices. But when it comes to healthcare, it's risk and reward, and there's opportunity costs. So already your data has been collected in Alberta for over 20 years in digital format and stored in databases. And physicians and nurses use this to try and provide better care for you. It's difficult because of the way the data is organized. And so recently Alberta embarked on deploying Connect Care across the province at I don't know what cost, it's probably over $1 billion. And that will connect every hospital in the province and centralize the data. And the promise is that you'll get better and more efficient care because a physician will be able to track your health, whether you were treated in Medicine Hat or Grand Prairie or Edmonton. It doesn't matter, they'll be able to see the whole thing. And in fact, my family lived in Calgary for 11 years, went to the US for 11 years and came back. And when I got a GP here in Edmonton, he goes, oh, I can see what drugs you were prescribed in Calgary a decade ago. It's there, and my number is still in the Alberta system. And that's very convenient for me. So the question you have to ask yourself is, do you want healthcare professionals to be able to see data from you and other people across the province to improve your health outcomes? Most people will say yes to that. They're fine with a physician accessing their data and the data of others to improve outcomes. So then the question comes, the AI professional at the shoulder of the doctor, do you want that person to not see any one specific data, but to see an aggregate data from across the province to be able to predict things like whether you're going to have a heart attack? Do you want that or not? And if you do want it, you have to speak up and talk to your politicians, because right now in Alberta that's not possible. It's extremely difficult for us to build those kinds of algorithms. And so there's a cost to that, and the cost is there's maybe a minute risk of loss of privacy or a disclosure, unwanted disclosure, but the flip side is not predicting your heart attack and maybe the heart attacks of 1,000 other people in Alberta next year. So you have to make that decision. What is more important? And if you feel passionately about this, I urge you to talk to your local politicians, because something has to change in the province, or we will be importing this technology from the US. We'll be paying a lot of money, like the $1 billion we're spending on Connect Care. That's a company out of Minnesota that we're paying for that. Instead of developing something here in Alberta. One of the main reasons I came back to Canada from the US is because of a public health care system and Connect Care, that everything in the province is connected and potentially we have true population level data, which means it deals with bias, it deals with inclusivity and diversity, and all that stuff is built into our provincial database. And we can build algorithms that are really powerful, and we can sell them back to the Americans, because their system isn't set up to build databases like that. Or are we going to wait for someone else to do it in the UK or China and buy that algorithm and pay a lot of money to deploy it in Alberta? Meanwhile, missing the opportunity to predict 1,000 heart attacks a year. So this is something you have to think about. Most people worry a lot about the privacy issue, and I get that, and it's important, and we need ethics and we need control. But inside the world of healthcare, remember now, there's not a single AI app in widespread deployment in healthcare anywhere in North America. And yet, we're worried about Facebook and all these things tracking us, but healthcare is still 20 years behind. Do you want healthcare to improve? Do you want healthcare to be able to mine what's happening in the province to prevent you or a loved one from becoming seriously ill? And if you do, something has to change.
I love that, and to add sort of a layperson's contribution is also you just look at contact tracing and some of the AI that was deployed through the course of a pandemic with an obvious surrender of privacy required, an exact mapping and logging of everywhere you've gone, and a huge and obvious benefit with regards to containing the spread of a pandemic that's impacting a society in major ways. Right? I mean, there's this constant debate. Before we go any further, I do want to ask you and Nicole about what your personal settings look like and what would surprise us or not surprise us about how locked down or not locked down you are.
So I had a funny story because I started, the deeper I get into this, the more I was like, well, I'm turning it off. No access to any of my data. And then none of my apps worked.
That's right.
I couldn't use anything. And I sort of checked in with some of my technical counterparts and said, why doesn't my stuff work? And they said, well, you're off the happy path. Like, you're not a regular user anymore. You're one of the weird cases that's hard for them because you said no to all this stuff. And so I sit in this uncomfortable space of knowing that I'm giving more data than I want because, convenience. Oh, it's awful. It's like, it's such the banality of evil. It's so tricky. And so I have this tension with my tech. But I also want to take this moment to very quickly mention a book by Virginia Eubanks called Automating Inequality, because we look a certain way, we're part of certain socioeconomic groups, and it looks different. Asking different kinds of people to share their data looks different. Yeah. It looks different when you don't trust your doctor for maybe good reasons based on what's happened in your community, or you've had university researchers come into your community and take your data. And not do a good job. And so I think it's just important as speaking to people who are designing these systems and at the forefront of making these things happen and thinking about the ethics and the use of it and what are we using it for. It's like it's important to look at how different people are involved and what it means for them to share their data. And not everyone has, we're doing a very small project looking at community-led police accountability. So you have body cams on police. There's no body cam looking back at the police. And so how do you think about who's able to use those algorithms and not only be the subject by inputting their data, but be on the other side of saying, what's the story of this data? What's the story we're going to tell with this data? Which metrics are we going to decide means you get the job or means you don't go to jail? And who gets to have those conversations, not only who's part of the data and who gets to say yes and no if they're lucky enough to have a smartphone. So it's just that part of just thinking about sort of the whole of us as well as thinking about one person at a time.
Where are you at, Nicole, with regards to surrendering your privacy?
I feel like I'm going to get hacked or something answering these questions. So, I'm pretty locked down.
First of all, what's your password?
Yeah, exactly. What apps do you use? So I'm pretty locked down as well. GPS tracking, I try to turn off unless it impacts functionality, which it does for lots of things. I think my last, what I would say is kind of guilty pleasure app is Instagram, which for similar reasons as Facebook, because it's owned by the same company, I have misgivings about. And more recently, I've been asking, does this serve me? Because it's increasingly turned into a shopping mall and I'm making bad purchasing decisions. I'm the one who buys the toaster. So yeah, pretty locked down and realizing my habits are not great all the time.
I was going to go on Hiro's point of systems thinking. In order to do something good, you need to focus on a very small problem, and you need to go deep. But in order for this to be truly useful and not evil, you have to look at it when it's applied in the whole system, the pathway. So we can build a good algorithm, but if you deploy it, example, you were talking about transcribing at the doctor's office. Yeah. It works very well, but if you deploy this system to a clinic that serves an immigrant population, or me, it will not understand what I'm talking about. You can play with a closed caption system on Google Meet. It doesn't understand me. What does it mean? Maybe I'm not heard in meetings. So it works fine. It was done well. It just doesn't work in all cases. And the question is, what is the impact of not working in some cases? Who gets hurt? What bad things can happen? So deep in the development and broad in the testing. And that's the way we have to go forward, because we cannot stop doing new things. We just can't.
So that's a principle that we use, or I've used for over a decade now. When we develop a tool to predict something like sepsis, I developed a tool at Moffitt Cancer Center to predict sepsis in bone marrow transplant patients. Myself and my students would attend the monthly quality rounds with the infectious disease docs and the bi-weekly rounds with the nurses who actually saw the patients on the ward. And you don't build it and throw it over the fence. You work with the domain experts very closely and iteratively. And when we finished building the algorithm, we got pretty good results. And sepsis is a major killer in hospitals. It's a bloodborne infection that when it gets bad, it can kill you very quickly, like within hours. So being able to predict it even a few hours ahead of time is critical. And our algorithm was better than anything that they had purchased. But we didn't just turn it on, right? You run it in what we call silent mode. And we were gonna have to run it for about a year in silent mode, where it would make predictions, and then once a month or so, the docs and us would go through and retrospectively look and see what it got right and what it got wrong, and then try and use that to improve it. And it had to run for a year because it wasn't a super common event, and we needed enough data to be able to prove that it was actually working. So it's not, you just throw the problem over the fence, the answer comes back, and you immediately flip it on and start making life and death decisions. That just doesn't happen in hospitals, again, because of the legal liability and the culture. So it's a real process of working closely with the experts. And if you think about it, if a new drug comes in to use, physicians don't understand, they don't need to understand the biochemistry of how that drug works. What they do need to understand is that the paper in the New England Journal described a clinical trial where they had 3,000 patients enrolled and the outcomes were such and such, and overall it's trustworthy. And AI is like that as well. It's a new type of intervention, and it will have to undergo clinical trials, and you have to build trust. The problem with AI, or the riskiest part of it, is it learns, or it should learn as it goes, so that when new patients come in and new things change, like the demographics, the algorithm should learn from that and improve. So imagine now if a doctor was prescribing a drug, and over time, the way it worked fundamentally in biochemistry terms changed. The drug evolved as you prescribed it. That's the problem we have with AI, is that these algorithms can evolve over time. They should evolve, but it brings a whole new layer of oversight. We have to be able to recreate the algorithms at a particular point in time to find out how they evolved into something worse or where they started making mistakes. And that's a huge engineering and technical burden for healthcare that we aren't there yet.
Ross, you appeared on Real Talk, I think it was last Friday or Thursday or something like that, an innovation panel, a magazine out of Edmonton, Edify, has named you one of their innovators this year. And I think in the highly stylized and fabulous photo spread, they call you Mr. Robot. I think, isn't that right? And I love that the Chancellor, I mean, you could have picked anything. Like we said, we talked about the opioid crisis last time under Chancellor Stollery, and here we are talking AI, and I love it because the more that you understand about what's happening here, you understand that Edmonton is not a leader in Canada when it comes to AI. It's recognized already as a spot of real potential and things really happening already around the world. So another question submitted by an audience member, I'll just throw it to the panel. How can Alberta leverage its expertise in AI in the context of economic development?
Well, easy. I shouldn't say easy, but it's straightforward. The path is straightforward. So what drew me back to Alberta was population level data, centralized, a fantastic university with a great engineering and computer science school and a fabulous medical school that's at the forefront of doing research. Thought leaders in AHS who are willing to push AI, and leadership in the university as well is willing to back it. And Amy, the group of AI experts. They're world-class, absolutely world-class. So, I've always had this list, and when this opportunity came up, I went down my list, and to solve one or two of those major issues is a big deal, and Edmonton checks like all 5 things on my list, And I thought, how many other jurisdictions in the world can do this? Like where I was at the time in Tampa is a great cancer hospital, but they have no idea about your heart history, and heart and cancer interact. And so I thought, well, it'd be really cool to get population level health data. Imagine the algorithms we could build with that and everything else. It was just a no-brainer. And Alberta also has a no-brainer to move. Alberta also has good ways of commercializing the algorithms that we develop, which I believe is critical. If you're going to have a real impact on healthcare, you have to go through regulatory, and that requires a corporation and financial backing to do that successfully. You can't really do it on your own because it's not a one-time process. It's the beginning of a long chain of events where they keep rechecking how you build your software and whether it's meeting standards. So you need a corporation to back the commercialization effort, and you need that to have broad impact in healthcare. So to me, healthcare and commercialization are sort of 2 sides of the same coin. We want to build algorithms, test them out here, spin them off to a company that will hopefully be based in Alberta, and then deploy that technology around the world.
I'm actually quite excited about the Alberta Government Lab that was just recently announced, and it's kind of going to Ross's point. Basically, you have a public-private partnership where the government sort of launches some challenges, which is use AI for good, and then the private sector comes in and assumes some of the risk and takes over some of the project management that they have experience with. And then you have experts, and I would call on academics to be the experts in the domain, to work there and bring the best of practice, the best ideas, to actually deploy them in the context of something that will be useful for society and something that will be real enough to be financially viable in the longer term. So I think this is a good step towards bringing all the ingredients to the mix, the vision, the money, and the expertise. And hopefully we'll see lots of cool stuff popping out of this lab. And I'm very excited to bring many of our interdisciplinary experts from AI for Society in that cohort to see what will come out of it. So, good stuff.
I want to echo Eleni's shout out for AI for Society, because I think this university is going to be a key engine of that growth by bringing together interdisciplinary experts. So many of the problems that we've identified, thinking about ethics, equity, bias, are going to be addressed by interdisciplinary teams. We can easily cultivate that in the university setting, and we're doing that. So AI for Society is the signature area that Eleni and Jeffrey Rockwell and the Faculty of Arts have been spearheading, that is bringing together researchers from all sorts of different departments, fine arts, social sciences, law, medicine, nursing, education. I have met so many amazing people, and that's, I think, really going to be key to our success. So not to pat ourselves too much on the back, but it's exciting. It's a really exciting place and time to be.
Well, research matchmaking has been my calling, so that was a great opportunity.
And I would just add to that, actually, the Chancellor mentioned in her opening remarks looking ahead many generations. And so when we think about what economic development looks like, from a law perspective, I'll probably think law should be making us money, so I'll step back with that one. But there is something there around the interdisciplinary work to say, like, there's some really neat work coming out of collaborations across different community groups and different government groups and universities, saying, like, what are the ethics of AI? What does that legal foundation need to look like? How do we build trust so that we're not all going, ew, our apps are gross and we don't actually want to use them? Like, how do we build businesses that are good and our children's children will thank us for those, instead of thinking just, that sort of quarter by quarter, so.
And even just from a public messaging or government messaging standpoint, I think that the general population wants to believe that their elected officials, their lawmakers, their decision makers are on it, or ahead of it, or forecasting or foreseeing, or at least respecting what's happening, as opposed to just barely keeping up. And that sends a strong economic message as well with regards to attracting investment, et cetera, and the like. To state the obvious, AI has something in common with cryptocurrency, and that is that one of the most notable objections centers around sustainability. And we have a great question here from an audience member. We thank you for it, on the environmental sustainability angle. The larger that the AI data set grows, or data sets grow, I should say, the more computing power is required to process. How does society manage the collision of these two competing objectives?
Well, I'll chip in because I do work in natural language processing with large models. These are the biggest models that have ever existed. And I was doing some calculations for a grant application, and if we wanted to train one of these models from scratch, we wouldn't buy the equipment, it'd be too expensive, but just to rent the equipment on Amazon would cost $11.3 million to do one training run for this model. So that's a lot of electricity. Basically, that's what you're paying for is electricity. And I read something that one of the recent models by Amazon was 800 megawatts to train the model. 800 megawatts of electricity was consumed. So the way that, what that means in practice is that very few organizations in the world can train these models. Only the largest, like Google and Amazon and Apple, and Microsoft and Baidu, they're the only ones who are training these models. And so it's very inequitable. And so what's happening is there's a neat initiative in Europe to train one of these models. It's like the Hadron Collider. It's a multinational effort, and they're going to train one of these models and make it completely open source. I'm looking forward to that. But technologically, this can't continue. You get a microscopic improvement in the performance of your algorithm by doubling the amount of megawatts that you use to train the thing. So the effort now is on smarter ways of designing new algorithms that perform just as well, but take a fraction, like a 1/100th of the energy to train. And we're starting to make some good progress in that area. So for me, there's a real technological sense to this. We're going to hit the barrier of bigger is better and just keep going. And we're very close to hitting that barrier now if we haven't already. And so there's a lot of effort into being smarter rather than just bigger.
So Ross is absolutely right. This is expensive and we have to be smarter. But I think that there is an opportunity for Alberta here. First of all, we have amazing sunlight. We have changes in temperature that could be harvested for energy generation. And we have a whole lot of, I don't remember how many zombie wells that could be repurposed to get a different kind of natural gas-based energy. So I think there might be an opportunity. I really do not know the economics of it, but we do have resources that could, we could tap into, renewable resources, to host some of these things here that would be beneficial to our economy and actually make the whole process more sustainable, energy-wise and environment-wise. But still, we have to become smarter. We cannot afford this for the long run.
This is a good one, and I'm glad that we'll have some time to get to this because it talks about essentially the growth or capability or maybe caps on AI, and we've alluded to it in our conversation, but not really dug in. This one from an audience member: how does or should society approach and manage the conflict of programs able to write or rewrite their own code? What controls should be or are in place?
Well, that's already happening because when you train an algorithm, the process of learning is effectively rewriting its own code. That's effectively what it's doing. It's not writing code the way I write code in Python, it's my language of choice, but it is changing weights inside a neural net, and that is causing the functions, the inputs and the outputs or the outputs from the same inputs to change. So effectively, we already have systems that are rewriting code. And the key to this is to keep the expert in the loop and keep ethics and law are so important to this, right? I mean, it's so critical that we have human oversight on what's happening and keep the expert in the loop. Just don't deploy these things autonomously.
One of the jokes I heard recently that's a little bit cynical, because there is this sort of like, is AI a person? You know, how will we treat AI? How do we think about it? And one of the jokes from a lawyer was, we'll know AI is a person when it can sue someone.
Yeah.
So I know humanity is much more than suing each other. But that does speak a little bit to this sort of double hype of AI is everything, and then AI is sort of our nightmares incarnate. And I think sometimes that story speaks to that you know, it's not, it isn't magic. It's scientific work that others here will do, and we can think about how we use it and how we regulate it and when we turn it off and on. And if we get to a point where we have an AI engaging in full consciousness in a way where it's saying, hey, order me the Globe and Mail and I'm suing my neighbor, we can talk about that, but we're not there.
Yeah.
It's really complementary to the human intelligence. The AI algorithms are really good at things we're not. In particular, finding patterns in vast amounts of data. That's tough and tedious for us, but things that we're really good at, like intuition and empathy, we're not even close to that in the AI world yet. So I'm not worried about Terminator. I'm more worried about getting AI algorithms in production in hospitals so we can use them for good.
But what's the is it Boston Robotics or something, I think is the name of the company?
Yeah.
And speaking of Instagram, Dr. Denier, we've all seen the video of the robot that like jumps in and flips and somersaults and gets up and then the next thing you think of is just wait till they start building themselves and building more and building armies and taking over, right? I mean, this is what the average conversation sometimes devolves to, but some people, it's obviously on their radar.
Yeah, and I think it's on people's radar because we see examples of this, right? So we're talking, what Ross is talking about, for instance, is empowering experts, empowering medical professionals, right? And that's a situation where professionals retain a lot of autonomy and control. So saying that we can have expert oversight is sort of logical, but we do see AI systems currently being deployed to control and surveil, right? That's like the platform gig workers that I'm talking about. And so I think we need to be very, very careful about who is affected in different ways and then how that impacts trust in general systems, right? So it's really easy to come up with scary scenarios when you're observing them in reality in other forms.
You know, sometimes someone will say something that should have been obvious or apparent, and then I kind of, maybe you four don't know what that's like. For me, it happens frequently. But I was talking to a buddy the other day, and he has a beautiful Tesla, and it's always an experience to ride in it, and I just marvel at it, and it's wonderful. And I said to him, I just don't know about that sort of next level. And we even see Cadillac. If Cadillac got it past their lawyers, they're now advertising on television during the Super Bowl, I think it was, a pickup truck automated pulling out and passing a semi on the highway and showing the guy essentially sleeping behind the wheel. And I thought, gosh, if they're advertising that's something, isn't it? And so I'm talking to my buddy about this, and I said, I just don't know if I could ever get to the point where I could really trust the technology. And he says, here's the obvious part. He says, you realize with the more automated vehicles on the road, the more they can communicate with each other and the less likely that head-on collisions are. And I went, right, you know?
Yeah. But what about the pedestrians? Actually, I was studying up for this, and I was looking at autonomous cars because there have been so many accidents. And I found a study, this academic study, where basically they give you choices on what should the car do. And the choices are, here's the car, the choice is always the same. Should the car continue going straight, or should it go to the other lane and hit a barrier? So you always choose between killing the people in the car or destroying the car or killing the people in front of the car. And it's kind of weird because obviously the numbers are always the same. It's always 2 people in the car and 2 people who will be dead. So how do you choose who dies, the people in the car or the pedestrians? And then they give you all these games about whether they're people or dogs, whether they're old or young, whether they're babies, whether they're male or female. And basically, I do not know what the right answer is. In the beginning, it was easy, but then it became more and more complicated. So I guess in the end, it's very difficult to think about expertise. It's more about us reflecting on what are our moral values. And there's even a cooler study where they studied moral judgment based on books from different ages, and they're different. So everybody's moral, but a moral 1,500 person is not a moral 2,000 person. So we evolve, and we have to reflect on what we want these things to do and what are the basic, 3 laws of Asimov that we want to make sure that, we don't mess up. Because we drive and we have accidents, and it's bad, and we feel bad. And I do not know that we have made good decisions in the split moment when you have an accident. But if you're designing a car and you want it to behave in some way, we have to figure out how we want to behave. And it's not that simple. It's just weird.
You're so bang on. Yeah, and it's a great time to wrap. It times out perfectly. This is right on time. Let this be noted. But isn't it interesting that we'll have how many motor vehicle accidents and unfortunately how many fatalities, even on North American roads over the next week, and nobody will question really whether or not humans should be behind the wheel, but we will see, unfortunately, I'm not trying to manifest it, we will see a high-profile accident at some point where an automated vehicle will plow through a crosswalk and it'll, it'll have a horrible impact, and it will drive this public debate around autonomous vehicles because of that human element and that human factor, right? Ladies and gentlemen, friends gathered here, let's hear it for Dr. Eleni Strulia, Dr. Ross Mitchell, Hero Laird, and Dr. Nicole Denier. What a fantastic conversation. Here to provide some closing remarks and perhaps some spontaneous reflection is the CEO of Amy, my pal Cam Linke. Come on up, Cam.
I never know if I'm supposed to touch these mics or not. All right, a little higher. Thanks everyone, and thank you everyone who helped organize this. I know putting on any sort of event is a ton of work, so just a huge thanks to everyone who put in a ton of effort to make this happen. These conversations are incredibly important, and I'm grateful that that it was the Chancellor's Forum was one of the opportunities to have these conversations. If you're interested in hearing more, we're very excited that over the last 20 years we've been able to partner with the university to play a hand in driving out the incredible excellence in AI here, and we want to be able to celebrate that. So May 24th to 27th, we are holding AI Week here in Edmonton. You can find out more at ai-week.ca. Spencer was frowning at me up there, I could see. There's something for everybody in there. We have hundreds of AI leaders coming in from around the world to take part. We have thousands of people in the city taking part in this, and it's going to be an incredible opportunity to show off the amazing expertise that we have here and to collaborate with experts from around the world at it. So whether you have just learned how to spell AI this evening and you're trying to figure out where is the impact on my family, we have a session on what some future opportunities for your kids can be in AI, whether you're looking at opportunities in your business, we have opportunities and talks on the impact that AI can have on your business and where and how you can start to look at leveraging it. Whether you want to see and hear from some of the incredible minds that we have and what they're doing and how they're pushing forward the field in AI, that's all happening during the week there. So again, would love to have everybody out, would love to be able to continue this discussion and have you out at AI Week in 10 days now. So very excited for that. And thanks again for giving me the opportunity to say hi. And to invite everybody out to the week.
Before you go, what's one thing you wish we would have talked about on the panel tonight?
Oh, Matt, well, I feel like you covered everything, really. The brilliant questions. Yeah, brilliant panelists, brilliant answers. Okay. Everything was covered.
Good.
Yeah. No, God, yeah. All right.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Ryan.
Cam Linke, CEO of Amy. Chancellor Garrity, why don't you come up and officially wrap?
Really wish I was as tall as Cam. Thanks, Cam, for those closing remarks and especially for the support for Amy. And I really, like all of you, I hope I'm really looking forward to AI Week, and it's an exciting time to really put a spotlight on all the things that are happening here, not only at the university but in the city, and it's great. If you'd like to learn more, Cam mentioned about their website. You can also check out the AI for Society signature area and Amy's website as well. You know, a couple of things struck me as I'm listening and kind of scribbling out some notes. And, you know, I think the one thing is if people were looking for simple answers, they weren't here. So that's not surprising, of course, because it's extremely complex, and some of the things that struck me as I was listening is this sense of augmentation, that AI is there hopefully mostly for good. It certainly can be used for good. It is, it's not, like Hero was saying, it's not like, who is this AI thing? It's a tool. It's something that we can use if we can use it appropriately to really make a difference in people's lives. That's my optimistic self. I think the word that came up many times was trust. And I think that's such an important thing, especially, unfortunately in the environment that we live in now, where I think trust is often missing. Unfortunately, trust in science, trust in truth, trust in learning. And so I think that's something that we all have a role to play in, to be engaged, to not just set it aside and say this is not something that I understand or can have anything to do with. It is to understand and build that trust and the confidence in the people that are actually behind this and making decisions. Because it isn't the AI algorithms that are making decisions, it's us. It's all of us. So those were just a couple of things that struck me as I was listening. I'd really like to extend my thanks to all of you for coming, to Nicole, to Hero, to Ross, and Eleni, thank you so much. And to you, Ryan, thanks always for being here and bringing out the best in the conversation. You're a pro at this. Thank you once again to our partners and the organizers for tonight. Amy, thanks Cam for being here. Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Science, AI for Society signature area. I always love hearing from Eleni about the things that they're doing. The External Relations team, the Office of Senate, thanks Tyrell and Amissa and everyone. The Faculty of Arts Resource Center, our American Sign Language interpreters and campus ambassadors, and our volunteer centers. So a final thanks. Thank you so much for being here. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to finally be able to have one of these in person. I don't know if Stan Blade is still here, but Stan and I were talking earlier. We're planning one for the fall. I'm going to make sure that it happens. That one will be on food sustainability and the important role that the university is playing in looking at those issues. So more to come. Thanks everybody for being here and have a great night.